Let's hit record. Welcome to our Tuesday night Stop LAPD Spying Coalition webinar. My name is Hamid Khan with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, and today is our 40th webinar for this year. We've been doing it every Tuesday since March 17th, and pretty much just going back. This is where we're based out of Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles, and where we would meet every Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock. So in lieu of where we can't meet in person, we've been holding these informational, conversational, organizing, call to action, you name it, type of webinars. And today, this is going to be the last one for 2020, but we'll be back first Tuesday in January. So happy to be here. It's a small group. So what I was thinking of doing typically, because of situations that we have had, because of Zoom bombing, we have been keeping it sort of restricted, muting and unmuting, but it's a small group, so we're just gonna let folks mute, unmute themselves. Not trying to police anybody's participation or thoughts. And then also, I'm gonna also open up the chat as well, so folks can, just talk to everyone publicly, where it doesn't have to be, that they have to come through the host. So today's year-ending webinar, we wanted to talk about the police state and data-driven policing. And it's a vast area. It's data has been central to everything that we've been organizing around, everything that we talk about. It's about information gathering and information storing and information sharing, and how that data collection through various means gets reconfigured, and it impacts our lives. It's not only about law enforcement that is collecting our data, or private corporations collecting our data. It's taken a life of its own. As so in a sense, how it impacts our daily lives, how it impacts our communities, how it impacts our health, and how it impacts our just overall well-being. So we wanted to have that kind of, sort of an open conversation. But first, what we wanted to do was that start off with a current situation that we are in, which is about the use of facial recognition technology. As you all may know, or if you don't, we're going to go through some of the basic stuff about, about facial recognition. But the facial recognition technology has been around, and biometrics type technologies have been around forever, going back to fingerprinting and various other things, where the FBI was the primary repository of millions of fingerprints and mugshots and various other things. But it has been expanding. It has really been being used by law enforcement agencies. Biometrics are being used by private companies as well, to basically datafy us. But now what is going on is that the Los Angeles Police Department, which is primarily the focus of our organizing, has been using facial recognition technology for about 15, 16 years now. And throughout, at least over the last few years, they've been claiming that they don't do that anymore, even to the extent that when we filed for public records, they said they're not using any facial recognition technology. But then a story broke earlier in August of this year, or September of this year, that the LAPD had used facial recognition technology about 30,000 times over the last 10 years. And now they are trying to get the police commission to create a policy. Our position really is at the coalition that we don't work towards reforming these things. Our goal is to completely dismantle and abolish and ban the use of these technologies. So in a sense, that's where our fight is, that how are we organizing, how are we building that power on the ground to not allow the police commission, or demand that the police commission reject this proposal by the LAPD for facial recognition use policy. But our fight's not going to end there, knowing the state of the police commission, that it's a rubber stamp body. It seems like this is an organizing moment. This is a call to action moment. How do we keep on building that power and knowledge? So what we thought was today to talk about facial recognition technology and to get some baseline stuff for us to understand through the lens of LAPD that what has been going on. And I'm going to be joined with my colleague Tiff Guerra, who's been doing some immense research around facial recognition technology. So in essence, when we talk about it, the coalition, we look at it through multiple lenses. That anytime we're talking about an impact or policing, just a program, we look at it that this is not a moment in time, and even surveillance, when we look at it, it's a continuation of history. So it helps us in understanding and putting ourselves in a both historic and current context as to what has been going on. We also look at some of the guiding values that we have is that there's always another. There's always constantly an enemy being constructed and created to justify the use of such tactics and such technologies. Another goal that we have is to desensationalize the language. Like national security, and always this very sensationalist sort of a news that is always out there that that this is the end of the world. And our fight is really anchored in human rights, while definitely there are legal tools to fight back for civil liberties and constitutional and civil rights. But it's really about human rights that are and at what level our being and rights are being violated. This is just for us to get a better understanding of the history of surveillance as well and policing, going back to lantern laws and slave patrols, and we're not going to go through all of that. We also have another webinar once in a while where we go through Surveillance 101, where we go through this in detail, but wanted to use this opportunity to ground ourselves as to where does facial recognition technology fit. It's not just happening in isolation. It's a part of a much larger architecture of surveillance. It's part of a much larger apparatus. And what we are seeing today is like the various forms of technologies, both human-based and tech-based surveillance programs and tactics that the LAPD has been using. And then to really kind of build towards that, how it fits into the broader what we call the stalker state. Because in a sense, what you're looking at right now is that how information moves within various sectors, within the public sector, private sector, law enforcement, just corporations, social media, international partnerships, on and on and on. So it helps us to understand the scale of how vast this apparatus is. So when we talk about data and data-driven policing, this is the sort of research, and it helps us understand that the scale of our fight. They also are helping us understand about knowing our fight as well. So where are we focusing on, and do we even know the depth and the range of what's going on? So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Tiff. But before I do that, I just wanted to see, like in this first 3 or 4 slides that I shared, if anybody had any, before we get into the meat of facial recognition, if anybody has any questions about what we just shared, about any slide or anything like that. Because we'll keep on, we want to make it interactive. We'll open it back again once Tiff is done with their conversation. So I'm going to pass it on to Tiff. There you go.
Thanks so much. Hi, folks. I'm glad to be joining all of us today. My name is Tiff, they, them pronouns, and I'm going to be talking a little bit more about facial recognition technology. As we go along, definitely, if folks have a question, then just raise your hand on the, I don't know, whatever you call it, on the using the icon, or just kind of indicate in some way that you would like to ask that question. We don't have to kind of wait until the end or wait for a pause. Okay, so looking at what is facial recognition technology. So this is pretty simple. It's a technology that claims to identify a person, or even can identify an image just using the points of a person's face. So typically a system does have 3 components. It has a camera or an image capture device. There's an algorithm, and there's a database. It can also just be a software component that is added to an existing system. So the algorithm itself is typically proprietary, but it does kind of all work in the same way, and that is just looking at the different unique points on a face and finding a pattern on that image, and then looking for that image in among a database. So that's a little bit about how it works. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. Okay. So right away, we can say that facial recognition technology is racist. It is inaccurate. And like many technologies that are predominantly designed by white men for white men or for white male America, the technology does have bias. It is less accurate when identifying faces of people who are not white men. Multiple studies demonstrate that the technology does have bias in identification, most of folks who are Black, women, trans folks, non-binary folks, also youth are most frequently misidentified. And what's worth noting as well is that misidentification is going to be even more heavily skewed if you are looking amongst a data set that is also going to be heavily skewed. So it's commonly used for looking at a mugshot database, which we know is due to the disproportionate policing of Black folks and of folks who are queer and trans as well. We know that that is going to already be skewed. So the risk of misidentification of folks is going to be even higher. And then just what we're looking at here, the graph that we're looking at, this is a pretty famous study that was done in 2018 called Gender Shades. It's a project by MIT, and it kind of took this intersectional approach, looking at how do some of the most commonly used algorithms treat, or how good are they at identifying these different categories of folks. And it found that error rates were 34% higher in darker skinned femmes versus lighter skinned males. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Okay, so now we're going to talk a little bit about what is the history of facial recognition technology at LAPD. So what we're looking at here is a map of the first place that facial recognition was tested in LA by LAPD. So this is Alvarado Corridor, the street running alongside MacArthur Park. And so LAPD launched this use of the software as part of their Alvarado Corridor project. And this was very much touted as an effort by police to reclaim the park. They were very clear in all their press releases from that time that this was experimental technology. It was donated to them by Santa Monica-based tech company called Nevin Vision, and they were very clear that we need this field tested. LAPD said we will do that, and the way that then Captain Charlie Beck reported on it was, he said, well, it's not a silver bullet, but we wouldn't use it unless it helped us make arrests. And kind of the point here is that for LAPD, what they were looking at was a reason to go in and make arrests. And if something results in that, then to them, that is a success, regardless of whether or not it's actually doing the thing that it claims to be doing or what the impact on the community is. Okay, so this entire operation, not just the facial recognition tech part of it, but the entire operation, which was pretty massive, resulted in over 1,000 arrests in 6 months. At different times, facial recognition was attributed of like resulting in maybe like 19 of the arrests in March, 20 more arrests in December. So there's not a lot that's known about like what were the specific outcomes and how many were linked to the facial recognition technology. Next slide. Okay, so just looking a little bit more as we talk about the history of facial recognition at LAPD, looking at the relationships with tech companies in LAPD. So Nevin Vision, this was a Santa Monica tech company that did donate the equipment, and they got press in return for that. So both LAPD and Nevin were very much in the press, releasing, you know, media updates about the technology, about what was going on. The facial recognition software was used on CCTVs. It was also used on handheld devices, which were also experimental. And what that did is police would point the device at a person's face, and it would try to scan their face and then identify them in real time. This was noted by police as being something like 94% effective, which who knows what it actually was. By 2005, Nevin was equipping LAPD patrol vehicles, which were used in Westlake as well, with facial recognition software inside the vehicle, as well as on the front-facing video cameras that were being used during stops. And something that came up for me as I was thinking about this is just the way that what is the impact on a community when something like this is being tested, because how is it going to change the way police are already policing the area? So for instance, if police are testing this facial recognition technology in their patrol cars, and they already are more likely to be pulling over people who are Black in the area, they're more likely to be kind of getting them out of their vehicles anyway. But is this type of thing going to make them more likely to have them get in their patrol car, for instance? So, you know, it raises those kinds of questions as well, as what is the impact further on a community, which is already being policed. So Nevin did get a lot of money from this venture, and they leveraged this relationship with LAPD ultimately to generate they generated a lot of new business leads, is how they reported it, and they did get acquired by Google in 2016. And next slide, please. Okay, so looking at LAPD's relationship with Motorola. So this is a tech company that has a long relationship with LAPD. In 2006, LAPD and Motorola launched the Smart Car. This was equipped with facial recognition, as well as license plate scanning capabilities. And along with Nevin, this was one of the first times that LAPD was using the license plate scanners. And what that meant for police and for the community was that instead of LAPD manually inputting plates, about 75 to 100 plates per shift, they could scan between 5,000 and 8,000 license plates per shift. And of course, they kept all that information and they stored it. So the technology was enabling a much faster accumulation of data with no clear expectation of how it was going to be used by police in the future. It was just accumulation of data. Yeah, so it's actually only this year that LAPD is now establishing a policy for license plate information that they've been gathering since that time, and which is very much an indication of the type of free reign that LAPD has had regarding the gathering of information from communities, this continuous data gathering, and how little the public knows about it, and how little we have opportunity to challenge it prior to it being used. So going back to more with Motorola, in 2006, they did also announce a partnership. LAPD and Motorola announced a partnership to monitor the Jordan Downs public housing complex with surveillance cameras. And they, again, were very much, you know, going public with this and touting this as the start of an ambitious build out to use remote biometric identification, which can track individuals citywide. They were saying that this is going to be able to, you know, more effectively respond to criminals. And they also made a very big deal of the fact that Motorola was donating internet. They were providing internet to the Jordan Downs housing complex for free, which of course they were doing so that LAPD could use that internet to for their cameras, for their wireless cameras that they were using to spy on folks. The Motorola sales manager at the time, Hugh O'Donnell, who actually was a member of the Los Angeles Police Foundation as well, that would kind of drum up donations for LAPD. He described it as an exciting opportunity for law enforcement and a test bed for us. And Motorola has maintained their relationship with LAPD today, and they still provide LAPD with mobile devices, and they may provide them with their digital in-car video, but I'm not sure on that one. So again, this highlights that relationship between tech companies and police, where communities become testing grounds for the technology without their consent or any consideration of what is the impact on these communities. Next slide, please. Okay, and something I just wanted to name is that when we're talking about this area, Alvarado Street and MacArthur Park, this area has continued to be heavily policed. And in 2015, this is an area that became policed by Operation Laser. Operation Laser was a location-based and person-based policing program that criminalized entire areas or zones and labeled them for heavier policing and heavier surveillance. And they also targeted people within these zones. And they would have been using those CCTVs. They would have been using all those devices that had already been set up and that they had already acquired. And when Operation Laser was ultimately shut down in 2019, which was a result of the sustained work and effort, collective work of this coalition and of our allies and of the community, Chief Moore did refer to it as an experiment. So saying all of this just to name how the same neighborhoods and communities are being targeted with all of these technologies over time, and how the technology may change, but the history and the impact of the programs remain in that area, especially for the residents that live there and have lived there the whole time. And just kind of noting that it's when police do roll out these new technologies or strategies, it's the same neighborhoods that are consistently bearing the brunt of that. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so how LAPD uses facial recognition today. They claim that they are only using it through LACRIS. This is you can see the acronym on the screen. This is the Regional Identification System that is maintained by the sheriff. This is, I believe, 64 different law enforcement agencies have access to this and use it. As of 2013, this contained at least 6.5 million mugshots, 3 million photos of tattoos, marks, and scars. And basically, it takes the biometric information of every person who is taken into custody by the sheriff. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the contractor who provides and maintains the facial recognition system within LACRIS, and again, it's the digital mugshot database specifically that LAPD is using within that. So this company is DataWorks Plus. They're the contractor. The actual algorithm came from Cognitech Systems, which is based in Germany, which I know because there's another company that has a very similar spelling that is not the same as this company, but so the algorithm is from Cognitech, and through this database, LAPD can check a person's, so they can look for a person's identification. They can submit a photo that's taken from a video or from another source and to check for a person's identification, but they can also look to see if a person is on a watch list. They can also set up alerts for further notifications so that they can get a notification if that person is taken into custody another time. So it's not just an identification system. And we also want to note that in addition to these uses of facial recognition tech that we're talking about, LAPD has also been exposed as using the technology made by Clearview AI. This is a third-party software that folks may have read about, as this was kind of something that came up in September of this year. This software was used to identify people based on images that were taken from social media. And LAPD was exposed as having numerous officers that were using this technology. And sometimes that did result in arrests. As far as facial recognition technology, the type that they're using through LACRIS and the type that they're trying to now get a policy okayed on to say, okay, this is okay if we keep doing this. This is the technology where they actually were using it over the summer. They admitted to investigate activities that took place during the protests, during the uprisings. the software was used on images that were taken from witnesses and from surveillance cameras. So that's the type of applications that LAPD has been using this for recently. Next slide, please. Okay, so LAPD kind of presents this as something that's just benign. They say it's just like a scanning process. It's just a search tool. It just helps us look through a database and identify folks. But we want to be clear that this is even in that capacity only, even if that was the only way they were using it, this is still deeply harmful. It doesn't just identify folks. It can also be used to geotag people, meaning tag people based on their location. It connects an image of a person that is captured by LAPD or third-party cameras to a location, to their name, to their address, to a vehicle, to a bunch of other information about a person. It can tell them how to find a person. It can be used to set up alerts for when a match with that person is found in their database or when that person is taken into custody. It can be used with most LAPD surveillance devices that use or that capture images or video. So taken from CCTVs, taken from wireless cameras, can be used to identify folks in an area, to map relationships, and can also be used in collaboration with other forms of data gathering like FI cards, which helps LAPD map relationships between people, with license plate scanners. So it's not just an identification tool, like no big deal. It is a big deal. It's part of their entire network of surveillance and data gathering. And all of this presents a risk to folks in the community as people are now being subject to further scrutiny by police, and this gives them an excuse to go and talk to folks. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just talking about what LAPD also has. So in addition to the facial recognition technology, just want to say that something they can do is something that LAPD has been able to do for a few decades now is they do use video and photo analysis from Cognitech with an H Incorporated. And this is a company that's based in Pasadena. And so this is just a way that LAPD, the capability they have now to analyze photos that are being taken from video and from cameras. And the way that they manipulate these images is of interest. Because this is the type of thing that does get submitted. It can be submitted for facial recognition scanning. So what they have now is this product. It's from Cognitech Inc. The CEO is an ex-LAPD officer. It enhances images taken from video camera. And specifically, an interesting fact about this specific company is that the photo analysis was used in 1993 following the Rodney King uprisings. It was used to identify and prosecute people who were filmed on the ground from a helicopter during the uprisings. Using an image that was taken from a helicopter of a person's arm bearing a tattoo, Cognitech claims that it was their enhancement of that photo that led to the successful prosecution of that person. LAPD endorses the company and they continue to use it today. Next slide, please. And this is just a quick shot of this is one of the things that the technology does. And again, this isn't facial recognition technology. This is kind of a step before that. This is them just looking at CCTV information or images and this is the way they can kind of manipulate an image that then gets passed on to say, okay, facial recognition technology system, who do you have that matches this? This is called face fusion, this particular tool. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so what's going on in other cities right now with facial recognition tech? In Detroit, the police there have been using DataWorks Plus as well, and they have been having some trouble with it. They have revealed that they have a misidentification rate of about 96%. A Black man was misidentified by the technology. I'm sure it was more than one, but this is the one person. This is a person that it was confirmed. It did kind of get press because this was like the first confirmation of a person being misidentified by using facial recognition tech. And it was found out, of course, that not only did the algorithm misidentify him, but the police were not sticking to the policy that they had said they were going to follow in terms of how they were even using it. So that was exposed. DataWorks Plus came forward this year and said they don't test the algorithm for bias or for accuracy. This case specifically has resulted in some members of Congress seeking to regulate the use of facial recognition tech, but of course we're not seeking regulation, we're calling for a complete ban. Other cities, including San Francisco, Orland, and San Francisco, Oakland, and Boston have banned government agencies from using the technology. Portland recently went a step further, and they even banned private entities from using it in public spaces. So next we'll look at what is going on in Los Angeles with facial recognition tech. Okay, so LAPD is trying to pass a policy. So this comes at a time when people are demanding change. We are demanding more than ever that the police be defunded, they be dismantled, that we divert funds away from them. But LAPD is kind of responding to this by pulling up all of these, old racist narratives, by saying that they will put policies in place, by trying to legitimize the surveillance of communities by saying, hey, we'll have a policy, we'll have oversight of this. And they're also expanding some of the existing LAPD programs that surveil, including their drone program, and also including their community safety partnerships program, which is something that they are investing a lot in this next year. And next slide, please. Okay, and this is our call to action that I'm sure folks have seen already, but yeah, this is what is still going on in LA right now, is we're looking to shut down facial recognition technology. Police Commission is still calling for comments. That does end at midnight tonight. You can send an email. We would also love for folks to sign on to our organizational letter. Next slide, please. These are the demands that we have in our letter. We reject the use of the technology. We want an outright ban, and we want an investigation to understand how this has been used over time in LA communities. What are the outcomes? What is the impact on the community? And next slide, please. This is our open letter where organizations can sign on. I don't know the URL for this, but this is on Knock LA. If you were to look up open letter to reject facial recognition technology, that would come up. And I believe we are asking for organizations to join with us until December 31st. Next slide. And this is my last slide. What questions do we still have? I kind of named some questions that have come up for me as I've been doing this research and talking with other folks about this. Like some of the things we don't know or not clear on. Like the policy says LAPD can't use cell phones. They can't use the digital in-car video to capture images. But what the sheriff knows, or what the sheriff does, is the sheriff actually has mobile devices as part of their system. And it's part of DataWorks Plus system. It's part of the LACRA system, and they use that in the field. So is that something that they're using? That's not clear. How has it been used in laser zones? How has it been used in Alvarado corridor? Where is it used the most? What are the outcomes? These are some of the questions that I have, but I will stop talking right now and just open it up and see if folks have questions in general, or just if there are other questions that we want to add to this as well in terms of what other information are we looking for?
Thank you, Tiff. That was very informative, and thank you for the details. So let's just now open it up to see, if people have any thoughts, comments, questions, or their own experiences with facial recognition or working around biometrics and all that. So the question is, why no talks about lack of, there's an acronym CCW in LA County. Do you do any? Concealed weapons permit. Got it. Okay. So any thoughts, any comments, any questions from anybody? Lloyd, were you gonna?
Sure, I guess a couple things will come into mind. It was meant that there were obviously other larger cities that are employing this technology. Did anybody look at what was happening globally, the use of this technology? I know the Chinese are the biggest and the first to really employ it, and certainly that'll be different, a different thing from what it would look like over here. I'm also thinking about when you talked about extracting data on everybody. Has anybody thought about the DNA component? I mean, aren't they also extracting DNA from our people?
Anybody wants to talk about that? We know that. Go ahead, Tiff.
Yeah, hi Lloyd, thanks so much. I'll just respond by saying thank you for raising the question about looking globally and internationally. That's something I have not been doing, but absolutely should be incorporating that. So thank you for raising that, and maybe other folks on this call can speak to that as well, who have knowledge about that. Regarding extracting DNA, I don't know in detail about that. I do know that the sheriff has been very much like it is part of a biometric database. They have started scanning people's irises with this same company, DataWorks Plus. So they, folks who are incarcerated, they take an iris scan, they save that information. They have folks' fingerprints. So it is part of, they have started kind of storing biometric information. I believe even their voice recordings. So I'm not sure what that full list of things is that they're storing on folks, but that's another area that yeah, we can be looking into. And again, maybe other folks have other knowledge about that.
There's also work in like crime investigation to like reconstruct people's faces out of DNA samples. This is kind of like an alarmist thing to say because this research is really bad. Like the faces that they can reconstruct from DNA have like nothing to do with the
Josh Peter.
So yeah, just to say that there are people that are trying to bring together this work with facial recognition with DNA biometric recognition, but it's kind of a pie in the sky thing, but we'll probably see more of it.
Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, so I do know that this technology has been really pioneered and embraced by Israel to police the Palestinian community. And one interesting thing there too is the recent assassination of Dr. Fakhrizadeh, who was the top nuclear scientist in Iran, was actually carried out using this technology. So they had an automatic weapon with a camera attached to it, and that camera used facial recognition to recognize him, and then that was what set it off. So it's definitely something that's being not just used internationally, but really pioneered internationally.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think if we could to go back as to going to the history of biometrics collection and biometric surveillance, obviously, that was a very clear colonial project as well. I mean, especially how the European colonization, how the UK or the Britain really kind of just started pioneering some of that, and then in the US. As there's histories around this biometric experimentation and the colonization of Philippines. So there's been a long history of the evolution and development of these technologies. Of course, now, I mean, and because it is become a major money-making endeavor and how it's being monetized, is through corporations. So of course, Chinese have definitely been very much on the forefront and advancing into some real-time facial recognition. It's interfacing with various other tools like drones and body cameras and other things. And as Adam was saying, Israel is a major player as well. So I appreciate definitely, Lloyd, for you lifting this thing. But it's again like this global phenomena of when we go back, that it's not a moment in time, but a continuation of history. That where has this really been really experimented on, and who's been on the receiving end? Chela, do you have a comment or a question? Okay, it's you can unmute.
I was saying you could read it, but now that you made me unmute. So TIFF and the coalition at large. Are we seeking reparations for the survivors of these programs, like of Operation Laser? And you were also naming TIFF that the facial recognition, like not the software, but like its beginning was even during the Watts uprising, that they even got someone's arm, and then they were able to prosecute that person. Is there ways that we are seeking reparations for these folks? And are there folks that we know of that have been affected, that are survivors that were able to get in touch with? I think that was a conversation we tried to start before the Rona happened. So I'm already realizing that question is, yeah, in it. Yeah, I mean, you could expound. Thank you. Muting.
Thank you, Chela.
Thank you, Chela. Yeah, at this point, we haven't named seeking reparations, but I think that's a discussion among the coalition. But we are doing that with folks who were impacted by Operation Laser, and this seems like that would be a part of the discussion in terms of what we're seeking right now. And as far as like understanding who has been harmed, I think that's kind of like where we're at in terms of like demanding more information on this. And that's kind of where we were starting from with when we put in the PRA at the end of 2019 to understand like, how has this even been used? Like specifically tell us more about how it's been used, where it's been used, so we can kind of start this process of uncovering what is the harm that was done, how has it been used against folks. So I feel like we're kind of at the beginning part of that process, but very much hearing that and agreeing with you.
Yeah, if I can add to that quickly, Chela, that everything that obviously our work is related to, I mean, we do our own deep investigation, look at the harm. So absolutely, our demands are very much rooted in reparation and, what is besides, dismantlement and abolition of these technologies completely. There is no room for any reform. There is no room for any oversight or transparency because you just can't. So absolutely, I mean, as we are building this thing, because already now we're seeing the impact, because I believe, and Shakir was probably going to speak about it a little bit more, that there have been some wrongful prosecution of people as a result of facial recognition that happened in Detroit. I mean, I think it was 2 Black individuals who were subjected to that. So definitely there's much to learn and understand, but building on our model around laser and that whole chronic offender program, reparations is a key part of our demand as well and our organizing. Other thoughts, questions? Okay, so I know that we talked about other cities are instituting bans on facial recognition technology, and there's been just a couple of days ago this stuff came out in New Orleans, and San Francisco has put a ban on, Portland has put a ban on, but I think it's also very instructive for us to understand that what is the scale of that ban. I mean, there's one thing to say a ban, But there is another thing to say that what are the fine points, finer points of that ban as well. So it doesn't become, because that's why for the coalition, our primary focus is not looking for legislative remedies or even legal remedies. The primary focus is really about building knowledge on the ground and building power in the community to organize and build that power to dismantle it. But if we're going to take a legislative route, what exactly are we talking about, and how does that play out in LA? And then what sort of momentum can we build? So I'm going to pass it on to Shakir, who's been doing a lot of work on that as well. So go ahead, Shakir.
Yeah, thanks, Hamid, and thanks, Tiff, for the really deep analysis of how facial recognition works and how it's been operating in LA and other cities. And yeah, just to jump on the point you said earlier about Hamid about the prosecutions, wrongful prosecutions, those are the ones that Tiff mentioned in Detroit by the Detroit Police Department, which is actually using the exact same DataWorks Plus platform that is in that the LA County Sheriff's use. So this exact same system using those different third-party algorithms that Tiff mentioned. As Tiff said, there's 2 people who were prosecuted based on image matches purportedly from one was like I think someone had something snatched from a car and they took a cell phone photo and police ran that through the database and matched it with someone. I actually wish I had it to pull up, but if you look at the photos, they look like a normal, like a person looking at it could tell you that they look nothing like each other. But that's the facial recognition match, and then both men were prosecuted for those offenses, and then eventually it came out that they had nothing to do with them. So that's the exact system that they're using here, and I think Chela is right that reparations is absolutely the right framework to think about that. It's not just about and reparations even more broadly for all police surveillance, thinking of it not just as, okay, there's a line of like conduct that police can do and we need to make sure we're carefully keeping an eye on that line, or even the idea of, okay, there's some trade-offs for safety and security. No, the point is like policing is all about kind of domination of our communities, exploitation of our communities, and it's a continuation of colonization, enslavement, and just as we talk about reparations for those systems, we also need to think about reparations for surveillance. But yeah, so to talk about the legislation stuff, yeah, this is something the coalition has been kind of thinking about as we think about, what it means to take an abolitionist approach to legislation, because, our approach with this technology, as Hamid Hamid said, is like about building community power to dismantle it. It's also, we're trying to, build and imagine and build a world where surveillance doesn't exist and is unimaginable. And so, that I think means not just kind of, imposing a restriction on the use of surveillance, certainly more than regulating it, certainly even more than saying you can't use it in LA. It's actually to try to kind of kill the entire ecosystem that produces these technologies. Like, how do you make something like facial recognition kind of untouchable? Like, thinking of it in the same way that, it's unthinkable for police to say that they want to use nuclear weapons or biological weapons. We've made those things untouchable, and kind of just there's a clear line there. So how do we kind of also create that, which means attacking not just police use of facial recognition, but like the businesses that are producing it, the university research that is involved, that is helping refine it, and just kind of the entire ecosystem that surrounds it. So so I think with that in mind, I mean, it's like, as we look at the bans that have been happening in other cities, we see kind of some like there's sort of like 2 sets of limitations that you're seeing in some of them, and they're a range. I mean, there's some that are, I'd say, more airtight than others, but the kind of 2 biggest kind of areas of alarm for these are, first, you see, like Hamid was talking about, that they're not that airtight, that a lot of them will have all kinds of exceptions for, okay, yeah, if police get their hands on a facial recognition match that someone else made, then they can look at, then they can use that, or that they can use it in certain exigent circumstances. Well, you know, as we know from how the legal system operates, exigent circumstances is kind of the opening that is used to justify one thing after another, especially in the constitutional framework of, you know, police can't do, the rule is police can't do XYZ thing, but if there's an exigent circumstance, then they can. And, you know, like whether something is exigent circumstance or not is going to be decided on by a court like months or years later. The fact is police on the ground are going to do what they want. And so think like that type of approach to it might be kind of attractive to lawyers and judges, but it doesn't, you know, it doesn't actually change the practice on the ground. So there's all those kinds of exceptions. The other issue that we're seeing is, and this is true of even the bans that are more airtight, is they're being paired with, at the same time that that the ban on a particular facial recognition or a particular type of surveillance is being enacted, as part of that legislation, there's also a whole package of kind of like a surveillance oversight and transparency and kind of approval process. So the subcommittee, we refer to these as surveillance bureaucracy, and we put out a kind of report and communication this summer that kind of talks about the problem with these surveillance bureaucracy ordinances that, you know, while they seem like, okay, they're kind of imposing some restrictions and creating some, you know, community limitations on use of this technology, the real worry about them is what they're actually doing is they're three things. One is they're creating community approval of surveillance. You know, they're saying that actually, yeah, that, you know, the police, it allows the police to go out and say, you know, the violent things we're doing, the invasive things we're doing, the harmful things we're doing with community approval. That, you know, we filled out the paperwork, we went through the process, we had a hearing, and the community approves of it. When in fact, we know that obviously that entire process, like everything, you know, else that happens through the system, like we see every week in the police commission, they're cooked by police. You know, police know how to play that system, and and when you give them those input criteria, this is kind of the second problem, is when you give them the like, okay, yeah, the technology needs to do XYZ thing and can't do ABC thing, they know how to rig that process to kind of tick off those boxes to be able to say, okay, yeah, here's how we're abiding by those. And kind of regulating the technologies in that way, and this is kind of the third problem, helps when we were talking about the ecosystem surrounding these technologies. When you regulate something in that way and you put these limitations on, you know, it can work in this way, or it can work if it's, you know, 90% accurate or whatever, that helps create the industry that's going to be building around those regulations and investing in kind of organizing around them. So, you know, we saw that actually this summer in response to the uprising. You know, a lot of big businesses were kind of trying to make these displays of some kind of commitment to the people's demands. And one thing we saw is a bunch of these companies said they were going to stop using facial recognition or selling it to police, basically until there was a regulatory framework for it. So, and those are all the big companies, Microsoft, Amazon, IBM, the three of them said this. Amazon, I think, said they're going to just stop for a year. Microsoft said, we're not going to sell to police until there's these regulations in place. Part of the play for those companies is they realize, you know, and those are the big companies, the small companies like that, like run LAPD's one, like Tiff mentioned, DataWorks Plus, that's like a small company it's like South Carolina based, and they just do a couple of these systems for police departments across the country. They are not, you know, pioneers of facial recognition research, but these big companies that are looking to be that in the future, they know that kind of putting a whole regulatory framework on it is going to help them kind of build invest in building those technologies that'll get adopted everywhere. So to give an example of that and how the laws and the ban legislation kind of structure that, I want to show the example of the federal. There's a federal bill that was also proposed this summer, kind of in response to the uprisings and everything going on, and also the news about these wrongful prosecutions in Detroit. And so I'm going to show the legislation, which, you know, can be a little boring to read legislation, or can sometimes feel like it's really opaque. But I want to just show it because I think it's actually in part just to show that it is accessible, and to show that it's actually really obvious. You can kind of see how these bans or even while they're pretending to ban these technologies, they're actually very much creating a pathway for them. So I'm just gonna, let's see. So first, okay, so I just want to start with, if you look, this is, I just like, when you look at like when this bill was announced, all of these kind of news stories and nonprofits talking about them refer to it as a ban. Facial recognition bill would ban, lawmakers introduced bill to ban. Even this is the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which is kind of a legal reform nonprofit that works on surveillance issues. They, refer to it as a ban, and throughout, how important it is to sponsor this facial recognition and biometric technology moratorium act, which they keep calling a ban. So let's look at the bill. So this is the legislation that was introduced in the Senate by Ed Markey from Massachusetts and Jeff Merkley from Oregon, I think. And so yeah, that's the name of it. It's pretty short. So it starts with, these are just quick like definitions of the different terms. And they're, that's kind of standard. And then you get right to it with, this is the prohibition. So basically it's saying it's illegal for any federal agency or, federal official, anyone to acquire, possess, access, or use any biometric, and they previously defined biometric to include facial recognition. So, okay, that sounds kind of cool. It sounds, yeah, it's now illegal for all these federal agencies to use it. But then it's like the very next section, there's an exception. There's always an exception. But if you look at this exception is actually kind of pretty massive, because what it says is that prohibition in Section A, that ban, will not apply once Congress authorizes, passes a bill and a new law authorizes an act that does these things, that it permits use of biometric surveillance, and just like, defines like specifically when it can be used, the purpose, and when it can't be used. It sets standards for that use. It sets auditing requirements. It sets these like protections for, racial, gender, equity, for free speech association, and it creates these mechanisms to ensure compliance. So right here in this bill that's pretending to ban it, you have just a blueprint for, this is what the regulation should look like. And it's saying, okay, we're just like, stopping the use of this technology, but here's the blueprint for exactly how you need to regulate it, do this ABC thing, and then you're good to go. And so what that does is that, and this is why like all these Microsoft, IBM, all those companies are supporting this, because they're saying, yeah, just give us the like, checklist for what we need to do and we'll be good to go. So that's why, even though this looks like a ban, what it's actually doing is creating, the roadmap for how this technology is going to spread. And again, yeah, so I think, just thinking about like, imagine that approach to like use of nuclear weapons by police, like if police had kind of, if at some point, I mean, I'm sure you can, get like a bunch of lawyers together to come up with, okay, here's some regulations for how to make sure like use of nuclear or biological weapons would be, equitable and transparent and all of that. Like you could come up with that, but at some point as a society, we decided that, no, we're not going to do that. Conversely, we decided, or we failed to kind of ban use of police chemical weapons. So that's why, in the uprisings, police were tear gassing us. And so many of us experience that as something that is actually like, there's all kinds of laws restricting the use of tear gas. Courts are constantly, enjoining it. There's all kinds of constitutional limitations, but none of that matters, because as soon as you create that kind of regulatory framework, police will do everything they can to abuse the technology within it. So that's kind of, as we think about these bans, being very careful about making sure that they're actually airtight, and that the vision behind them isn't just, oh, this technology is kind of dangerous, so we need to like restrict that danger. But the vision for it is, this technology is unacceptable and we need to be completely kind of killing the market around it and make the technology completely untouchable, completely get rid of it.
Thank you, Shakir. So yeah, I think this has always been a major issue for the coalition as well. And in full disclosure, we have actively organized against the ACLU. I mean, which for their attempts to bring in ordinances, for their attempts to bring in regulatory frameworks, because in essence, as Shakir was saying, what we have is that it not only these regulatory frameworks are really just a rubber stamp, but they provide a whole lot of cover. Number one, that these legislative pieces supposedly are in the name of the people because they're ordained by the city. So now the first point being that it's being ordained that the people are willing to be surveilled, right? So we reject that no. I mean, when we talk to people and talk about the depth and the scale, people are just like, no, F that. We're not into this thing. Secondly, regulatory frameworks provide, more bureaucracies. They create more bureaucracies where, how to do that, when to do it, who's to do that, but if they still do it, then they provide more money for trainings and more resources. So, and on and on and on. So in a sense, the question being that is our fight that, but in a sense, so, but yet at the same time, people have also been coming at us like, okay, well, you don't want this, but what do you want? We're like, well, just completely dismantle it and just to abolish this thing. So, and it's a simple ask. But then again, there's also this thing like, what could an ideal abolition legislation look like? I mean, it almost is an oxymoron, like, asking the system to legislate abolition. What would that look like? But, there are opportunities to create some models. So want to open it up to see as to what people think about, this is what the coalition's position is, and how does it basically, and here's a piece that we had released in July or earlier in August or September about some of these sort of regulatory frameworks that were passed. So would love to hear people's thoughts and feedback. Go ahead, Adam.
Yeah, I wanted to ask Shakir more specifically. So if a regulatory framework necessarily like carries with it sort of ways for surveillance to be carried out, have we looked at what the legislation in these other cities looks like and how successful they have been at actually blocking this, or are they basically paving the way for that sort of like regulated surveillance state?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and some of this is like, it's the time scale is this is happening around us, and so it's hard to know. I think at least with the facial recognition, the cities that have banned it, I'm not sure kind of what the use of it looks like these days. I think like the ban in San Francisco, they dismantled it was a very similar system to Lacros. It was like a countywide kind of mugshot search system. They got rid of that system. Now, what that actually means for other uses of facial recognition, like Tiff was talking about, kind of, the Lacros system in LA is just like it's like the kind of most bureaucratic standard form of it. There's obviously all kinds of other unauthorized use, but the bigger issue is just the kind of long-term effect of what is being paired with them. So even if they're getting rid of facial recognition, which is obviously a win, and that part is good, it's like we have seen throughout the history of police reform and prison reform, like what is accompanying that especially here, what's accompanying it is that if it's an ordinance that like you said is kind of is creating the regulations for it, but is also normalizing the idea of surveillance at a time when we could be attacking it. So that I think is just harder to see, like, and especially because we're at this moment now where we have a real opportunity to kind of take an abolitionist approach to this stuff, and there is really popular momentum for that. It's no surprise that this moment then also becomes the one that when kind of politicians and legal reformers looking for a way to stop short of those demands are passing these reform and oversight bills that aren't what people are asking for, but it at least looks like a step forward. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, I think those cities that like the ones that Tiff mentioned in the slide that have gotten rid of it, they've gotten rid of facial recognition, but perhaps at a cost of like kind of creating this pathway for future forms of city approval for surveillance.
But the apparatus is still there. I mean, I think that's also where the different ways that it just comes back. So yeah. Are the other thoughts, other comments? Cool. Well, we can continue with this piece as well, because where we wanted to go next was I was going to invite Peter to just kind of from their vantage point and research and mapping out, because what we are also seeing is the scale of the public-private partnership. We're looking at the scale of how vast this whole enterprise is, how vast the whole surveillance apparatus is. I just want to quickly go back and do a quick snapshot of about 10 years ago. Like this was a report that the Washington Post had released called Top Secret America back in 2010, just a little over 10 years ago. And at that point, and unfortunately at that time, you could access, and they had done some really awesome this digital visualization piece and interactive piece of where and everything else is. But just thinking about the scale and how many, it's like a feeding trough that the about 10 years ago, their investigations findings were that 1,271 government organizations and 1931 private companies work on programs related to counterterrorism, homeland security, and intelligence in about 10,000 locations across the US. Now, this was 10 years ago, and if you think about it, how it has increased, we don't even know what that numbers are. They are talking about like almost 900,000 people hold top security clearances, like, almost 1.5 times people who live in DC. And in Washington surrounding it, 33 building complexes for top secret intelligence work are under construction or have been built since 9/11. They occupy an equivalent of almost 3 Pentagons or 22 US Capitol buildings, 17 million square feet of space. And there's so much redundancy in this piece as well. And then, just almost like 50,000 intelligence reports. So I wanted to kind of throw this out there for us to get a sense of how vast this whole enterprise is. And while a lot of times the conversations focus on the main players like Palantir and Microsoft and IBM and all of that, but there's a whole economies. I guess the word is economies of scale, if I'm thinking of it correctly, that how much money is going around in the surveillance industrial complex. So I'm going to pass it on to Peter to talk more about it to us.
Yeah, thanks, Ahmed. Hi, everybody. I'm Peter. So also thanks to Tiff and Shakir for like a really comprehensive look at the history and legal dimensions of facial recognition. Just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of the corporate side, the way that companies interact with producing this technology for the police. So we do already know, or people that have spent time in the coalition, that we hear about these companies like Palantir being involved in creating policing systems, or academic startups like Predpol, which create these algorithmic systems that have the names of these companies. But really, a question that we should be asking ourselves all the time is, how do these kind of relationships between these corporations and these policing systems come about? So really, one way that I look at it is kind of as a matchmaking process. So on the one hand, there are companies that are looking for opportunities in other sectors. So these are companies that are sitting on these algorithmic technologies, they're sitting on these data sets, and they're looking for opportunities to apply them to other circumstances. So say there's a company that's very good at making an algorithm for facial recognition, or they're sitting on data about a ton of people's faces, and they think, what could this be used for? So it's kind of an opportunistic entrepreneurialism that comes into play for developing or for applying these existing technologies to policing. And this applies to even really mundane technologies. Like, for example, there's a company called Tableau, which they just make little charts and graphs out of data. You can use this software to create like a chart out of a data set. And they came under fire from their own employees because the software was being used by ICE. So here we see how these technologies that are not necessarily divisive can be applied to these applications in policing. So on the other hand, of course, I thought somebody said something. On the other hand, of course, it can be from state programs like DARPA or the LAPD itself that might commission a program to develop certain algorithms for certain applications. So what's important to recognize in these cases is that usually the applications begin in a much more banal way. So for example, there could be a trial to develop an algorithm for predicting some kind of health issue or seeing if certain people are at risk for being predisposed to a certain health condition that would threaten their lives. And then from there, this technology kind of bleeds out into other sectors. So for example, facial recognition, in 1993, there was a project to use facial recognition to make it so that people couldn't apply for multiple driver's licenses under different names. So they would use facial recognition to tell if the same face was used for multiple driver's licenses. And of course, this gradually spilled over into other applications, especially in the carceral booking process. So in the case of facial recognition, you're absolutely going to have both directions of this matchmaking between these policing projects and corporate agendas. And one thing that I want to emphasize about this is that it's not really enough to take issue with the fact that these companies are driven by profit, because there's a kind of opportunism that comes with collecting data that has really nothing to do with just these ways that we normally think about corporations being bad in terms of wanting to, sell data and things like this. And so what I mean by this is that owning a very powerful algorithm or a large database of information really invites this kind of mission creep. So this idea that, well, we could actually use this information or we could use this algorithm to do other things, and also to have more people invest in our software and invest in our platform. This goes back to what Shakir is talking about with these standards, is that kind of setting up these technologies to be used in a widespread way benefits the people that are creating them. And another thing to kind of take away from this is that the applications for these technologies are very blurry. It's very difficult to establish boundaries in the ways that these technologies will be used. So we see this, for example, in Los Angeles, actually, the Los Angeles Football Club is planning to use facial recognition to make entry into stadiums and things like this contactless, so you don't have to touch anything. And that's one application of facial recognition that we could think of as being not very divisive, but then we could see how this would spill over into other things. Of course, facial recognition is used very often in stadiums to look out for criminals and detect criminals, things like this. And there are other examples of that as well. But I think to kind of summarize all of this, one thing to keep in mind is that nobody really owns facial recognition. The main issue with this technology is being able to use it in a systematic way and also to normalize its use. So we can demystify the technology a little bit by acknowledging that it would be maybe impossible to ban anybody on the earth using facial recognition, but it's a different matter to ban the use of it in a systemic application, for example, applying it to large databases of collecting information about people or using it in real time.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, can you just talk a little bit more about the last point that you raised, the application side of it? Because obviously, there's they come back and reset and reconfigure and take different shapes and mutate in so many different ways.
Which part did you mean? Did you mean the part about the applications can be?
Yeah.
So I think there is, this kind of goes back to what I'm talking about with the idea of mission creep. It's you can create a facial recognition technology for one application, and then it can be very easily applied to a different application. But also, providers of these technologies can take advantage of this ambiguity between applications and specifically develop something for one application, knowing that they could also use it for a different application. So we see this in the case of a Chinese company which applied for a bank loan to develop technology for body temperature screening in crowds, which was related to coronavirus. But somewhere in the fine lines of this, this proposal, they also stated that they need this to improve the accuracy of identifying people that were behind masks. So there is this recognition by people that are providing the services that you can create it for one application, then it can go to another. We see this with Predpol as well, right? Predpol was created to predict crimes, and then they eventually wanted to use the platform to predict where coronavirus would occur. So, yeah.
Thank you. Other thoughts? Because I think one of the areas that is also of a lot of concern is around workplace surveillance, and the scale of that workplace surveillance as well. That how people are constantly being policed, and we know that there's a whole lot of move campaigns around Amazon and various other companies as well around warehouse workers, that how they are being traced and tracked, and how these technologies are being deployed there.
Yeah, that's another place where the connections between coronavirus and existing algorithmic solutions come into play, because there are a lot of companies that create these technologies for kind of managing where like laborers are at any given time, for ensuring like compliance to certain regulations. And then these companies also now want to apply these technologies to, of course, checking to see if people are socially distanced in the workplace. But the same companies that are working on these solutions also are companies that have worked on making ankle bracelets and things like this. So yeah, there's crossover in every direction.
Lloyd, you lifted the issue of contact tracing, and you want to talk about some of that, your concerns or anything?
It just sounded like, one of those things that you mentioned mission creep. It starts out being some benevolent, thing that we all need or at this time, but can be certainly used, in nefarious ways.
And this is also, just to add to that, another area of work that the coalition is participating in, that we've been working with some public health folks, and also the UCLA COVID Task Force on Race and Equity. And this continues to come up around contact tracing. That the whole idea, and particularly, on one hand, it's almost a rock and a hard place, that like, okay, well, people want to know, what's happening around when it comes to this pandemic. But yet at the same time, the cost and knowing the players. So for example, Palantir, which has come up in our conversation quite a bit, is a mega data. They just went public, data processing company and various other things. One of the started by Peter Thiel, was started by through a venture capital arm and investments by the CIA several years ago. So now Palantir is the main contractor with Health and Human Services in their operation. Prevent? No, not Prevent. It's another operation that they're involved in. So, and knowing that what they do, so I think particularly contact tracing and the history of public health in this country, the history of eugenics, the history of how medicine has developed, and what has been the history of that, experimentation as well. It raises a whole lot of alarms around there. Andrew, you raised an issue around school testing and surveillance. Do you want to, and some other pieces around facial recognition and its origins, you want to share some of that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, for the school portion of it, I think it's really straightforward. There's just like a lot of news articles coming out right now. I teach at a school that's small enough and boutique enough that we don't do a lot of this, but at big research universities where people take standardized tests, they're required to use a locked down software that's quite intrusive on people's machines. And they do facial recognition to try and verify who's taking the test. And all of the racial implications that we see with other facial recognition are really upfront and forward with it. In particular, phenotypically dark-skinned people are often not getting recognized by the test-taking software, and they're failing it and having to work with their teachers in order to improve it. And so it's just another case where I think, just in another sphere, all of the problems are arising in all of these ways that are deeply discriminatory and have unequal outcomes. And also, I think just there's this interesting thing about facial recognition that if we want to go back to its long history and its precursors in the early 20th century, it all comes from aerial photography used in World War II in order to spot bombing targets. And facial recognition, or just object recognition through machines, is developed in order to automate that aerial bombing process. And so, while there might be some use cases that eventually start diverging from it. Sort of baked into its DNA is this idea of recognizing targets in order to discriminate between them and ultimately target them and treat them as things to be eliminated and to be the subject of violence. And so I think that in the long run, this is always going to be there, and it's something that's unavoidable.
Thank you. So maybe if folks can feel comfortable sharing as to in their own sort of workspace or school space or community space, how are they seeing the surveillance apparatus expanding or operating? I know the issue of smart cities comes up and things like that, but and while we're at it, can somebody give us like a quick snapshot of when we say smart cities? What exactly, I mean, we are hearing so much BS around artificial intelligence, smart cities, like this whole jargon is completely out of control. So anybody has any views about smart cities? Peter?
I was gonna
Sorry,
say,
sorry to put you on the spot.
no, no worries. Well, it's a really broad term, but it really refers to this process of trying to create more mechanisms for using data and data analysis to optimize different functions of the city. And these functions could be anything from making buildings more environmentally sustainable, but also for improving law enforcement. And as we're talking in these other circumstances, there's a lot of overlap between these things as well. So maybe when you're trying to improve transportation, then you're also improving a kind of surveillance at the same time. So there's a lot that falls under this umbrella.
Hamid, your question about surveillance at work, I'll just share my perspective, and that is that like I work for a massive nonprofit that works feels very much like a corporation. But we work in like a large warehouse, and there's just surveillance cameras everywhere, and they are essentially there to like at first I thought they're there to make sure we're not, no one's stealing from the company, which is why they're there. But it's also very much about people are very much tracked in terms of like to the minute, like how long is your break? What are you doing? Are you like, it's about productivity. It's about how many minutes are you being productive? And if you are, over on your break, or if you're using some time that you're clocked in, not working, then that's seen as stealing from the organization. So it is about loss prevention, but it's more about like productivity. And it's just a very gross, and very ableist, and it's a very gross environment. So that's just like thinking about like surveillance at work. And I don't know what else they do. That's what we see. That's the part that we see.
Go ahead, Brian.
Hi. So I guess if I'm only going to speak from my experience, like I have a similar experience to what Tiffany was saying earlier. I work at a company called Barnes and Noble, where they sell books and other worthless crap. Well, worthless crap. Books are cool, but the crap they have there is pretty worthless sometimes. But okay, so like I remember one time I was putting away some books, right, and I put them away, and like there was a camera right on top of me, and a phone was ringing far away, and I was like, okay, I'll get the phone in a bit. I just gotta put away these things first, and I put them away real quick, and it wasn't that long, and right before I get to the phone, like, a customer asked me a question, but there's no camera showing that. So like when I got to the phone eventually, my manager's like, "What are you doing laying around standing there all day? You're wasting time. You're killing my money. You're wasting my pay. I'm very limited on payroll. What are you doing? You're stealing from us." And I was like, "Oh, yeah, okay." And my manager did this whole thing where she like stared at the camera for about, I'm going to approximate 6 out of 8 hours of her shift, she would just be staring at this camera and be writing notes and behaviors. And throughout the year, she would talk about how I saw you on the camera talking to a customer for about 5 minutes. What was that about? Why did that take long about that? And another thing was like, you were standing in a certain area for a while. What's going on there? Kind of insinuating that I was trying to sneak things in my pocket. And I was like, no, I was just standing there because I thought it was a little messy, so I cleaned it up a bit. You know, I had like a towel in my hand, but she couldn't see that. So she thought that I was like stealing. And then I had a friend who actually got fired because they said that because the manager said that they looked like they were stealing candy when it turned out they were putting their hand, and they did it in an angle where they walked to another place and it was off camera and they put it there. And it was mostly because like they thought they heard a customer coming, so they were approaching them, but it turned out that someone else got the customer and they said, oh well, here's a spot I can put this candy here, so they put it there. Yeah, that's the end of my my experience with surveillance at work. And then as for school, like I have never experienced surveillance at any school that I've gone to, but I wouldn't be surprised if my college started doing that after COVID, because I've noticed they're trying to do some renovations. So I wouldn't be surprised. But I feel like for me, the most horrible thing about being surveilled at work is that I constantly felt like I had to do something, even if there was nothing to do. Like if I looked like I was not doing something, like I can literally be sitting there researching about a book for a customer, and because I look like I'm just standing there, it looks like that I'm not doing anything. And it felt like I had to constantly be moving, and I get tired after a while. And I had friends who were disabled that honestly had to keep moving, even though it wasn't great for them to do so. But anyways, that's the end of that long ranty story that I have.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Yeah, definitely. I mean, it goes to show, we always talk about how surveillance is the tip of the policing knife, and how it leads to a whole lot of social control. So it's almost like, what you're talking about is like the control of the environment and the control of the body and the movement of the body. And then obviously, as a result, I mean, the term comes in as false positives. You've spoken about some false positives as well that have showed up, and, so yeah, thank you. Lloyd, were you gonna share something?
Yeah, this thing's got my head kind of spinning a little bit. I've been thinking about sort of like what Brian said, as an employer that I've worked for, or many of them that I've worked for, that surveilled their employees, and and was constantly, it's really harassment. Um, I've worked in the private security business, and I'm proud to say that I've finally decided to retire from that. But a number of the venues I've worked for were situations like the stadiums that were referred to before, and I could see this this type of technology being utilized in the very near future. So I guess what I'm kind of thinking about is, do you envision a situation where, say, for example, the technology is banned as far as law enforcement and as far as the city is concerned, but then there would be still used by private companies, such as the big stadium over there in Inglewood or something like that, and then accessible by law enforcement through other means. You know what I mean? So I mean, the private security companies using it, and then if by some, as you talked about, Shakir, manipulation of the of the regulation, they're able to gain access to that data. I could foresee something like that, and that's a big concern.
Yeah, no, that's right. And that's definitely something to really watch for, both at the kind of just micro level of seeing, like in these bans, like if making sure that they're banning not just police owning or operating a system, but contracting with a private company to provide it, or even using the output, the like match, anything, like again, like make the whole thing untouchable. So it's not just, okay, private companies are doing it. But even more broadly, yeah, we were actually like one thing that we've been kind of talking about this issue with is with regards to the Olympics, and the plans in LA. Like the chair of the Olympics committee, Casey Wasserman, has been talking about how the vision for the Olympics is that that your face is going to be your ticket for entering, you know? So they're envisioning even like, oh, this will be a good opportunity to spend millions like deploying like cameras and facial recognition everywhere, which obviously, you know, tracks what happened in the 80s with the Olympics of all this kind of military equipment and tanks and everything going to the LAPD that they then use to terrorize communities for the next 10, 20 years. So in that similar way, I think we're going to see that with data, and especially with private hands. So we've actually been talking to some organizers who are working on the Olympics issues, and they brought up this example of privatization from Tokyo, where in the lead up to the Olympics there, that actually in a really similar, kind of eerily similar way, I forget the years, but the last time that they had the Olympics in Tokyo, the people like the police chiefs or whoever kind of helped run the official security for them later went on to become the kind of founders of these two like competing private security companies that in Japan, like the police don't necessarily play like the same role of being really cutting edge with like technology and surveillance and stuff. They're catching up, but like these companies really run it. And so they're talking about, yeah, in the lead up to their next Olympics, these companies now they get the contracts for doing basically the policing for them. And the facial recognition they were talking about there is they have these robots, like literally robots that kind of roll around and detect faces and will then can stop people and flag them. So, you know, it's literally to the point of like private companies can be using fucking robots with facial recognition. And, you know, as Adam mentioned, the like example of the assassination of the Iranian nuclear scientists, like they're literally able to automate like, you know, weaponry from them, you know, and LAPD obviously has used drones for assassinations too. I think with the killing of Chris Dorner, that they used a drone in that way, I think tied to explosives or something like that. So, you know, a lot of these obviously like this feels kind of alarmist to be reaching at these like extreme examples, but when you like think about what's becoming very normal and real, especially in the private context in other cities and even in LA, like it's not that science fiction-y. Go ahead.
Could I also say, well, it might sound extreme, but that's how they're going to argue the point too. I mean, they're going to argue from the extreme point that, you know, we've got all these terrorists and all this you know, stuff that we've got to worry about.
That's right. Yeah. And that's how, you know, as they talk about drones and they talk about facial recognition, it's going to be, you know, this is the only way to catch like, you know, a child molester or something who showed up on footage, and we can't get it in any other way. So they're also using those exceptions. I wanted to also lift up this, what Andrew's talking about Brian Jefferson's new book. And yeah, I think that book, I had an opportunity to hear Brian speak. Actually, it's something that Andrew organized, and I read the intro to it. And it really kind of tracks some of the stuff Peter was talking about the role of these companies. And I think the way Brian talks about it is that, you know, the history, like throughout American history, we've had kind of racial capitalism in different forms, obviously, like going back to kind of plantation capitalism and other forms of extraction that are really racialized, and that, you know, business motives and business firms are at the forefront of that kind of maintaining a racial hierarchy. And he talks about these like tech companies and information capitalism as the latest version of that, especially through smart cities, as like, you know, they're using like this like data and IT and databases and all of that to, in the same way, kind of maintain racial hierarchies and automate the kind of racial oppression that has always been existed and always been fueled by profit motives. But now, you know, just as like previous industries had their own version of that, like now it's the, you know, IBM and Google, and like this is the way that policing is the way that those companies are participating in racial capitalism.
Thank you, Shakir. Other thoughts, suggestions, questions? Also, if folks have any suggestions and ideas for the next year, because obviously our goal is really to be out there in the community, and we, just as organizing and all of that, but up until we are not, like, how do we continue this building through these webinars? So any suggestions folks may have would be are very welcome. Well, calling out the local facial recognition companies more, absolutely. I think what it does, we need to be doing that. Cool, thank you, Lloyd. We're going to be wrapping it up in a couple minutes. So I think just any last comments from anybody? I know folks who've been helping organize this. First of all, just want to really appreciate their work. The first Tuesday of the month is our webinar on the police state and gender and sexuality. So I want to really just honor Chella for their leadership and to organizing those conversations, and turning that into a global conversation and bringing folks from all over the world, both locally and really kind of looking at it through the local impact as to what is going on, but then how it reflects, what the impact is on a local level. So Chella, any thoughts about what we could see next year? Anything percolating?
I think I want to continue the discussion of how COVID is impacting folks internationally, trans women specifically. So you'll see more of that. You'll see more intersectional dialogues. I think, and I also think those are the only things I'm thinking about right now. I know that this year I kind of dropped the ball with SWAT. I picked up the ball, then I dropped it again. So I'm planning to pick up the ball back again and do things with SWAP, which is a sex workers outreach project, Los Angeles. So you'll see more of that. And we'll talk more about that as well this coming year. So yeah, those are the things. Muting.
Thank you. Shakir, do you see the next year sort of unfolding as we're building our fights?
Yeah, no, I mean, well, first it's like, who the fuck knows what's gonna happen if it's like this year? Yeah, obviously, as Chella said, like thinking about the kind of ongoing impacts of COVID and even like how it has restructured our society, especially as we get maybe beyond the point of like, yeah, the vaccine, but also so then it becomes the era of, yeah, like all the transformations that happened during this period and how they obviously increase inequality, increase surveillance, increase policing. And along with that, yeah, like kind of the continuing continuation of the uprisings and, that the period of those couple weeks when in June was like really felt for so many of us like this like moment of experience in practicing abolition in the streets. But like the several months since then, I'm just texting with someone right now about the Breathe Act legislation that is like this like kind of legislative package that came out of that is being pushed around the country. And yeah, like I think we're going to continue to see a lot of the institutionalization of a lot of like abolitionist practice and all of that. So just and with that kind of, yeah, like how abolition becomes like just like a brand of reform kind of. So yeah, just keeping an eye out on all of that and what it'll look like for all these like institutions and universities and nonprofits and even businesses to be kind of taking on like a abolitionist or like FTP type thinking, but like, yeah, like, but you know, it's not the real thing.
Others, feel free to share your thoughts. What are you thinking? Take a few seconds. Tiff, maybe just I'll go to some of the core folks of the coalition and then, just to keep this conversation warmed up.
Yeah, thanks, Hamid. Yeah, I appreciate what Shakir said about like who the fuck knows what it's gonna look like, but just been kind of reflecting back on this year, just been very inspired by all of the collaborative work that has been going on, all of the sharing of resources, sharing of information, lots of building been going on. A lot of pain has been, felt in communities, and that will continue. So just kind of preparing for like, how are we checking in with folks and seeing what folks are going through right now and what folks need right now. And then also kind of continuing to build that mutual aid and to be sharing information, building with each other, and really continue this like mainstreaming of the conversation that we're seeing around defunding, dismantling the police, and just really like, yeah, just continuing and all of that. Thank you.
Yeah. Anybody else? Peter, have any thoughts?
None right now.
Okay. I want to make sure I honor people's presence and not to put people on the spot, but please, if you feel like sharing a thought, I'm just going to call on Francis to see if they have any any thoughts.
Yeah, I was gonna call out Francis too.
I
My friend,
knew,
yeah. Yeah, we can hear you.
I knew that was coming. I actually was just last week was just looking at some new, I mean, this has been used in the field for a while, but just like the use of devices for to collect people's fingerprints for immigration officials. Sorry, I'm a little brain dead. But like, I think what's interesting that I still, I'm always like constantly thinking about like new strategies on how to like bring in particularly like my Latinx community that seems a bit more, when we're talking about like recent immigrants, like sometimes their faith in the police here compared to their own countries where police really didn't do much for them. And then coming here, they do feel some safety. This is obviously not for everyone, but I hear a lot of that talk and sort of figuring out a way to outline, like educate a lot of people on that pervasive relationship between local police and ICE and immigration and customs enforcement. Like they're very wary of ICE and not so much of, let's say, the police in some instances. So it'd be interesting to sort of like merge that for a lot of folks, and also talk about like the flip side of that is seeing how amongst a lot of my clients that they don't call the police because they are fearful of that, like those who know that there is that sharing of data, they're scared of calling the police when they're like victims of like some very serious crimes. And I don't know, I'm wondering like how, like I feel like there's so much history with this coalition, and I'm trying to like translate that to spaces that I'm usually in. Yeah, so it's kind of like a project that I'm thinking about, because surveillance in like the federal, like officers and like federal agencies have always just been in the background, but now that I'm getting to know more about like how LAPD works and all this technology, that it really isn't new, and that it's all connected. It's just like a moment of clarity for me, and also just this feeling that I want to share it more with folks. If that made any sense. Sorry, y'all.
That makes a whole lot of sense. Would love to just look at it, that how in the broader, context of migration and immigration, because it is, that's what it is. It's about tracing and tracking and monitoring of people. So, and that was the whole idea behind the stalker state, that how people are being traced and tracked and stalked. So absolutely would love to have follow-up conversations on that. Others, Mamta, any thoughts?
Ishala?
Thank you. Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead, Shell.
It's okay, Baba. Okay. Actually, what Francis brought up a good point. For those that don't know, I organized a big ball. For those who don't know what a ball is ballroom culture. It's for trans and queer. It actually started amongst Afro and Afro-Latina and Latinos in New York, queer and trans people to like create a space because they weren't belonging in the 70s and 60s. And so we used that to actually protest Mitchell Farrell at the spaces that we've been taking over, right? We worked with the group because in order to do it right, we felt like we didn't want to appropriate a culture that wasn't mine, or my other coordinating persons. It wasn't our culture. So, and they kind of took it over, and they were not abolitionists. There you go. They were not anti-FTP. I mean, they were not pro-FTP. They were not, anti-ICE. They were like, when I would say shit like that, they'd be like, oh. I'm like, so there's a lot of conversations around that. And especially with Black folks too, around like, though like there's been a lot of like filming, and there's been a lot of things around like uprisings around Black bodies being taken. Black people still have that notion that good cop, bad cop. So I would also love to challenge that narrative within like specifically trans Black people, queer Black people. Especially because like they need to know we are like one of the most targeted folks when it comes to the state and policing and immigration. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about those things.
Absolutely. What better place to create and then have a ball, and then, or activities like that to create that opportunity for the conversation. Thank you, Chilla.
Mm-hmm.
Others, Mamta, any thoughts?
Yeah, I one of the things that I think would be really great to have on one of our Tuesday webinars, the intersection between sort of US militarism, what's happening with what's happening in the world right now with the increased sort of rhetoric of war against China and Iran and Venezuela, and what's happening at home, and the connections between policing of colonized communities at home with U.S. colonization abroad, especially in this moment with this administration. I think would be an interesting thing to look at and talk about those parallels.
Most definitely. I think that'll be, maybe we'll reach out to you to see how we can plan something. Definitely. Others? From folks who have not shared or spoken, or Zach, Any thoughts? Or Fernando? I know I'm calling people out, but just creating space.
I think, yeah, maybe just to add, the idea of China was brought up a couple times during this conversation, including by me. I think just to say that a lot of the technologies that are being piloted there, being used there, are informed by a lot of practices here. And it's definitely important to not think about things that are happening in China as being like completely different or a completely different strain, because there's a lot of crosstalk between these companies that are providing these services and competition to create them.
Definitely. Thank you. Last couple more minutes we have. Ricky, any thoughts?
Well, it's been very interesting, first of all. This is one of my favorites, but I had asked a question earlier, and I know we had put a lot of emphasis on law enforcement, but I believe that the more aggressive entities out there is the private security companies and private corporations that need some kind of leash on them.
Mhm.
I mean, that's just one of my concerns, and I think I put a question up earlier on the chat, but anyone can pretty much tell me, has anybody put any kind of restrictions on the private security companies and the private corporations?
Mhm. Well, I'm glad you raised that. Of course, I mean, obviously, in a system that is we can call state capitalism, where the state is in service to capital and the expansion of capital. So we know that but I think it's also, there's definitely a move afoot. There's been a lot of organizing going on, at least in the world of surveillance as well. Particularly how tech workers organizing is going on. There's been organizing going on around warehouse workers at Amazon. I think the bigger question for all of us is that where does this organizing lead to? Are we looking towards reforming a system? And as I think somebody, maybe Shakir, who has stated that one of the things that we're heading down the road is where abolition is now being sort of this mainstreamed in a way that the whole language, where abolition is going to take more shape of a reform than anything else, where we will be pushed towards looking at things in a more kinder, gentler way, which ultimately is going to circle back and produce the same results in the long run as well. So to your point, Ricky, definitely, I think there is organizing going on, but there's a whole lot of work to be done. So thank you for raising that. Please, Adam, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, this was really interesting. I really appreciate everybody sharing the information and the time. One of the things that I really took from it was both in Shakir and Peter's talk, and Tiff definitely, this discussion of, I don't think the police needs high tech equipment to be racist or to oppress people, but it gives it this sort of film of legitimacy, and it makes it seem specialized in a certain way where, oh, if they have this technology, then surely there's something scientific or advanced about it. But actually, it's the same old racist policing as previously. It's been going on for hundreds of years. So yeah, I thought that was really interesting. And then just the way that lines the pockets of corporations, and they're able to profiteer off of that. And the fact that these algorithms rely on compute resources that are really intensive, and specialized technologies that are being developed, and people are making billions of dollars off of that. So yeah, it's quite an ecosystem that's cropping up.
Mm-hmm.
It was interesting to hear you guys break that down.
Absolutely. And if we thought the military industrial complex was vast, the surveillance industrial complex is absolutely infinite, because it's just because now we are looking at this whole dogma of scientific objectivity. And so that's where it's going. So, well, cool, cool, cool. Well, folks, if nobody else has a comment to make, so did you want to make a comment?
Can you guys hear me?
Yes, please, we can.
Oh, okay, that's good. I thought I wouldn't even be able to be heard. Okay, I have a suggestion that is pertaining to defunding the police or not to defund them. My aim, I would like to see is that we go into the school academic system and try to put a plan there for teaching the community of people as we're going to school, just like we go to school, we learn a different trade or whatever. If we can go to school and start learning policing, or if there is any way to connect volunteers in the community to different policing groups, like security companies that's willing to do some training, or the police department itself that's willing to do some training, and start having some of the community people go in as community volunteers that's not necessarily under the corporate police department.
Well, that's a lot there. Obviously, from trying to abolish a system of policing, which has been in place and its only role has been to really oppress and cause harm to the communities. I think the question would be, like, how do we starve the beast? Rather than just feeding it more. But I appreciate your comment, and I think this also makes up for some really active conversations as we enter into the new year as to where all this is headed, and how much more work do we have to do amongst ourselves and with each other as well. Definitely. So thank you for participating. So
I do want to. I do want to just say that definitely it needs to be, where they're trying to work to distribute some of the funding in other places. But when you're looking at the amount that they're paid per week, is what I've learned, and I haven't verified it myself, but I believe it to be true. $57 million every week to pay the police their salaries. That's just a lot of money, and if that can go anywhere into type of training volunteers or paying people that would train the volunteers, and then in response, it's like a tool or a skill that the people that's volunteering, they learned how to use it in their own family. Like a lot of times you have to call the police to come and save you. If you learn how to control your emotions and be a little, look at it at a little, look off, I think how you call it when you're looking off distance, you're looking at it from a different perspective, from detaching yourself from if we can learn how to manage our emotions, we can learn how to detach from the situation and try to manage it, that's basically, I want to say basically that defunding, it needs to happen, yes, because it's going to be repeating. It's like building a house on top of an old structure that's really not good, the sand of the land or whatever, the pollutions of whatever is under there. It needs to be taken down and something there, but it's got to be a medium. And that's why I say the volunteers learning.
Right. No, thank you. Thank you. So, or the other option would be that $57 million a day into 365 days, what sort of jobs it can create, what kind of housing it can provide, what kind of access to healthcare it can offer, what level of education and child development and youth development it can be invested in. So I think absolutely. So the goal really is that are we investing in our own communities by starving this beast, where the conditions on the ground are as such that which create more health and well-being of the community rather than our dependency on the police as conflict resolution. So because ultimately they are all violence workers, as somebody else said, workers with a gun. So and that's why we put a report out to before the bullet hits the body, like one of the conditions on the ground that we need to address. But on that note, want to appreciate and thank everybody. Thank you so much for this conversation. It's the year. This was our last webinar for the year, and looking forward to for 2020. This was part 40, but we're back. We're back on January 5th, and our dear Chella is going to be facilitating that. That's for first Tuesday, so look forward to that. And we're going to be here. So thank you all so much. Be healthy, be safe, and we'll see you in the new year's. Thank you. Have a good night.